Have you ever felt like you're doing everything right with your money in America, and it still doesn't feel like enough? Take Maria. She's 38. She maxes out her 401k match at work. She doesn't carry a credit card balance, and she still lies awake some nights doing math on her phone, trying to figure out if she'll ever actually get to stop working. Here's what she doesn't realize yet. She's sitting on $150,000, and depending on how she arranges just 5 simple Vanguard funds, that money can turn into one of 2 very different futures. Build it one way, and Maria builds a passive income engine that pays her cash every single month for the rest of her life, without having to sell a single share. Build it the other way, keep up her monthly investing, and based on historical S&P 500 averages, that same $150,000 realistically grows into a multi-million-dollar nest egg by the time she's ready to retire. Same money, same 5 funds, completely different life. Let's build both. And if you want to see exactly how these dividend yields and tax rules impact your own bottom line, hit the subscribe button right now. I break down the real math behind American wealth every single week. What if I told you that following the golden rule of American investing, just by the S&P 500, might actually be leaving money on the table? Before we break down the exact 5 funds in Maria's portfolio, let's talk about why this single decision matters more than almost anything else she'll do with her money this year. If you're like most Americans, you've probably heard just invest in an index fund 100 times. And that advice is good, it's just incomplete. Nobody ever tells you that an index fund isn't one thing. It's a whole toolbox. And the version of investing where you just buy one fund and walk away is very different from the version where you actually understand what job each fund is doing for you. Quick refresher in case some of this is new. An index fund doesn't have an expensive manager picking stocks. It just owns everything inside a particular index, a list of companies chosen by a set of rules. That's why the fees on these things are almost nothing. Vanguard's S&P 500 ETF, ticker symbol VOO, for example, charges just 3 cents a year for every $100 you put in. Nobody's getting rich skimming that. The fund just tracks the market and gets out of the way. This is the exact moment many people get stuck, though, because just by the S&P 500 only answers part of the question. According to S&P Global, the index is made up of about 500 of the biggest, already successful American companies. It's a phenomenal foundation, but it's also just one slice of what's actually out there to own. It leaves out the smaller American companies that haven't had their breakout moment yet. It leaves out entire other countries: Germany, Japan, the UK, Taiwan, South Korea, where publicly traded companies also compete, innovate, and pay their shareholders. And depending on which of these pieces you lean into, and by how much, you end up with a completely different financial outcome, even using the exact same list of 5 funds. That's the part almost nobody explains clearly, and it's why Maria's story matters. She's not choosing between good funds and bad funds. Every fund we're about to cover is a perfectly reasonable, low-cost index fund. The entire decision comes down to the mix. How much goes where? That's the whole lever. Let's dive into exactly how she built that mix. And hey, if you want to see more breakdowns exactly like this one, make sure you hit subscribe to Orin Invest so you don't miss our next portfolio deep dive. Here's why this matters right now. In 2026 specifically, we've just come off a stretch where a small handful of enormous American technology companies, often called the Magnificent Seven, have driven a massive share of stock market gains. In fact, according to S&P Global data, just 10 companies now make up over a third of the entire S&P 500. If you felt like the stock market and the everyday economy you actually experience are 2 completely different things lately, you're not imagining it. You're not crazy. A handful of companies have carried a disproportionate amount of the load. That has created 2 temptations for investors that pull in opposite directions. One temptation is to just go all in on those mega cap winners, because look how well they've done. The other is to get nervous about how top-heavy and concentrated things have become and start wondering whether you need exposure somewhere else. Smaller companies, other sectors, or other countries as a shock absorber. Maria's 5-fund portfolio is built to resolve that tension instead of picking a side. She's going to own a piece of the giant tech winners. She's going to own a piece of the smaller up-and-comers. And she's going to own a piece of the world outside the United States. Why? Because no single country, not even America, wins every single decade in a row. If you look at the historical data, there have been 10-year stretches in U.S. market history. The 2000s are the textbook example, where American stocks actually lost money over an entire decade, while emerging international markets saw massive growth. Owning international funds isn't isn't a bet against America. It's just refusing to bet your entire financial future on one single outcome. So here's what Maria is actually solving for with these 5 funds. She needs something rock solid to build her foundation around. She needs something with real upside if the current US winners keep winning. She needs a long shot slice for the smaller companies that haven't had their moment yet. She needs income that shows up in cold hard cash, not just on paper. And she needs a piece of the world that isn't tied to the American news cycle at all. 5 jobs, 5 funds. Let's meet them. If you want to build wealth in the US stock market without staring at charts all day, you really only need 3 funds. Just a quick reminder before we dive in. I'm a financial educator, not your personal advisor. So treat this as a framework, not personalized advice. Let's break down the 3 fund mix. Fund 1, VOO, the Vanguard S&P 500 ETF. This is the anchor. It owns the 500 largest publicly traded American companies, weighted by size. So the biggest names, the Nvidias, Apples, and Microsofts of the world, make up the largest slices. According to Vanguard's mid-2026 data, VOO yields around 1.2% in dividends. If you reinvest those dividends over time, the S&P 500's long-run total return has historically averaged around 10% a year. There's nothing clever about this pick. It's the floor everything else stands on. Fund 2, VUG, the Vanguard Growth ETF. This is the engine. Instead of holding the broad market, it strips out the slower-growing companies and focuses entirely on roughly 200 of the fastest-growing, most highly valued names, which means it's heavily weighted toward tech. The yield here is tiny, under 0.5%, because these companies plow their profits back into growth instead of paying it out. But historically, that reinvestment has translated into a noticeably higher rate of return than the broader market. This is where your portfolio's upside lies, and also where your account will feel the sharpest drops if those big tech names stumble. This is where I used to fail constantly, by the way. I'd chase whatever fund had the best chart over the last 12 months, and jump in right as it cooled off. Don't do that. You don't buy VUG because it was hot last quarter. You buy it because it plays a permanent role in the mix, no matter what the headlines say this month. Fund 3, VB, the Vanguard Small Cap ETF. This one owns roughly 1,400 smaller American companies. Companies that generally fall below the massive multi-billion-dollar threshold needed to enter the S&P 500. No single holding dominates this fund. The idea is simple. Every giant company was small once. Small caps have actually lagged the giants for years now, and their recent performance trails both VOO and VUG. So why hold it at all? Because it's the one slice of the portfolio betting on tomorrow's winners instead of yesterday's. Of course, knowing what to buy is only half the battle. If you put these funds in the wrong type of tax account, you could lose thousands to the IRS. Hit subscribe, and in the next video, I'll show you exactly how to split these funds between your Roth IRA and your taxable brokerage. Now, let's look outside the US, because ignoring the rest of the world is a massive blind spot. Fund 4, VA, the Vanguard FTSE Developed Markets ETF. This fund owns established, stable companies outside the US and Canada. Think Japan, the UK, Germany, Switzerland, and Australia. We're talking about massive global brands like Nestle, Toyota, and Novartis. Its dividend yield is typically one of the highest of the group, currently hovering around 3%, which is over double VO's yield. But that income comes with a trade-off. Developed international markets have heavily lagged US markets for over a decade in terms of price appreciation. Highest income, slowest growth, living in the same fund. Fund 5, VWO, the Vanguard FTSE Emerging Markets ETF. This owns companies and economies still on their way up, places like Taiwan, India, South Korea, Brazil, and China. It's been one of the most volatile, historically underperforming corners of the market for the last decade, and it comes with real geopolitical risks. But at the same time, it regularly offers a surprisingly high dividend yield that rivals developed markets. Which brings us to the second biggest mistake Americans make, home bias. That means quietly keeping 100% of your money in US funds without ever actually deciding to. Surveys of individual investor portfolios consistently find that the overwhelming majority of holdings sit entirely in domestic stocks. But according to global indices, while the US dominates, it still only makes up roughly 60% of the world's total public market value. If you hold 0 international funds, you are entirely ignoring 40% of the global economy. That's not a strategy. That's a default nobody chose on purpose. The third mistake is treating index fund investing as one-size-fits-all. and never revisiting the mix as your life changes, meaning you contribute the exact same way at 25 as you do at 55. Here is the secret. The 5 funds rarely change. The weighting should, as your timeline shortens. 5 funds, 5 jobs, 2 very different ways to weight them based on your age. Let's break down the exact percentages next. Here's the part almost everyone gets backwards. Picking solid funds is the easy part. Anyone watching this video could screenshot 5 tickers and be done in 10 minutes. Quick reminder, this is for educational purposes, not personalized financial advice. The decision that actually shapes Maria's future is how much of her $150,000 goes into each one. Because these same 5 funds, weighted differently, produce 2 almost unrecognizable outcomes. Let's look at Portfolio 1, the income build. Maria puts the biggest slice, 40% or $60,000, into VA, Vanguard's Developed International Fund, because that 2.5% plus yield is the piece doing the actual paying today. Next, 25% or $37,500 goes into VWO for emerging markets. This adds volatility, but it brings massive long-term growth potential as developing nations expand over the next few decades. Then 20% or $30,000 goes into VOO, the anchor, keeping a meaningful chunk in America's biggest 500 companies. Just 5% or $7,500 goes into VUG, the growth engine, enough to keep some upside in the mix without it dominating. And the last 10%, $15,000, goes into VB, small caps. That's the long shot, size small on purpose. Add it up, and the American funds, VOO, VUG, and VB, total 35% of this portfolio. The international funds make up the other 65%. Maria isn't turning her back on the US. She's just letting the higher-yielding half of the world take the lead. Blend those 5 weightings together, and this portfolio runs at roughly a 2% starting yield. If we look at historical data and project a blended price appreciation rate around 7 to 8% a year, our total return lands near 9 to 10% annually. Run that forward inside a tax-advantaged account like an IRA so we don't have tax drag. After year 1, Maria's $150,000 is projected to sit around $165,000. Nothing dramatic yet. By year 10, projections put it near $395,000. By year 20, around $1,040,000. And by year 30, assuming those historical averages hold up, this portfolio is projected to reach roughly $2,740,000. And here's the number Maria actually cares about. By year 30, this portfolio is projected to be paying out somewhere around $54,800 a year in dividends. Now, inflation will affect what that buys 3 decades from now, but nominally, that's over $4,500 a month for the rest of her life, without touching a single share. The shares stay put. The dividends just show up, get reinvested along the way to fuel that growth, and the checks keep arriving whether the market had a good year or a rough one. What do you think of Maria's allocation? Would you tilt more heavily toward the US? Let me know your exact portfolio split in the comments below, and hit subscribe so you don't miss Portfolio 2. Now, let's look at Portfolio 2, the growth build. We are using the exact same 5 funds, but completely different weights. Now half the portfolio, 50% or $75,000, goes into VUG, the growth engine. That higher historical appreciation rate is exactly what this version is built to chase. 30% or $45,000 goes into VOO, still the anchor, just a bigger one. 10% or $15,000 into VB for small caps. And the 2 international funds, which were 65% of the income build, get slashed down to a combined 10. Just enough to keep a small hedge against the US having a bad decade. Blend these 5 together and you get a starting yield under 1%, blended dividend growth around 8%. And, if we assume the aggressive historical tech run continues, a hypothetical blended price appreciation rate closer to 11.5% a year. Run the same 30 years in a tax-advantaged account. Year 1, about $167,000. Year 10, roughly $447,000, already pulling ahead of the income build. Year 20, around $1.3 million. And by year 30, this version is projected to reach approximately $3.98 million. Nearly $4 million out of that same $150,000 starting point. But here's the twist that catches most Americans off guard. That much bigger account is projected to pay out only around $36,400 a year in dividends by year 30. That's about $3,030 a month, over $1,000 less per month than the smaller account. Imagine finally seeing, side by side, why bigger and better aren't automatically the same word. Income build ends up worth about $2.74 million and pays roughly $4,570 a month. The growth build ends up worth nearly $4 million, but pays out roughly $3,030 a month. The smaller account pays out more cash every single month than the account that's over $1 million bigger. Now, before you assume the income build just wins, there's another way to pull cash out of that bigger account, and it's the one most U.S. retirement planners lean on: the 4% rule. Based on the famous Trinity study, the idea is that you can withdraw roughly 4% of a portfolio's value per year in retirement and have a very high historical probability that you won't outlive your money. Apply that to the $3.98 million growth account, and you get about $159,000 a year, around $13,265 a month. That is almost 3 times the income build's payout. Now, inflation will take a bite out of that purchasing power over 30 years. But if your only goal is maximum spendable cash, the growth build using the 4% rule is genuinely hard to argue with. Even an ultra-conservative 3% withdrawal still comes out to roughly $9,950 a month. So why wouldn't everyone just build the growth version and use the 4% rule? Because that monthly cash only exists if Maria sells shares every year to generate it. She is drawing the account down. The dividend build never asks her to sell anything. The shares stay fully invested. And that difference matters most in exactly the year it's most dangerous to sell, right after a market crash. Sell shares to cover living expenses during a downturn, and you lock in those losses permanently. It's a well-documented danger called sequence of returns risk, and per historical data, it is one of the most common reasons people retire with a large account and still run dry decades later. The income build largely bypasses that failure point. Yes, severe recessions can cause companies to temporarily trim dividends, but historically, dividend payouts are vastly more stable than stock prices. You aren't forced to sell off your shares at the exact bottom of the market just to buy groceries. So here is the million-dollar question. Are you team income or team growth? Would you rather have a smaller account that pays you without selling, or a massive account you slowly sell off? Let me know your exact strategy in the comments below, and make sure to subscribe so you don't miss the next breakdown. So which portfolio should Maria actually build? Both are legitimate. That's genuinely the honest answer, and I'm not going to pretend otherwise just to make this video tidier. The growth build hands her a larger total portfolio value. If she's comfortable selling a slice each year and riding out the market's timing, it can produce a consistent stream of spendable income using something like the 4% rule, which is based on decades of historical U.S. market data. The income build hands her a smaller total portfolio balance, but it generates a cash payment that shows up automatically. Historically, those dividend payouts tend to grow over time, and they usually prevent her from having to sell a single share to generate cash, even in a bear market. Plus, depending on if she's using a Roth IRA or a standard brokerage, how she pays the IRS will look different for each strategy. Basically, one is a bigger pile she gradually takes apart. The other is a paycheck that arrives while the whole pile just keeps sitting there. Here is what I actually want you to walk away with today. And just a quick reminder, I'm just a guy on the internet. This is for education. Always do your own research. First, stop thinking about which ETF is best and start thinking about what job do I need this money to do? Is it an anchor, an engine, a long shot, a hedge against the U.S. economy? Once you assign the jobs, picking reasonable, low-cost funds to fill them stops being complicated. Second, your waiting isn't supposed to be permanent. Just like a standard 401k target date fund, someone in their 20s or 30s generally has more room to lean toward the growth build. Time gives a portfolio room to recover. But someone within a few years of retirement usually shifts weight toward the income build. At that stage, the goal is stability and cash flow, not maximum theoretical upside. The 5 funds barely change. The weights should evolve with you. Third, don't let the internet talk you into thinking extreme strategies are required. Plenty of Americans land somewhere in the middle, running a classic 60-40 or 55-45 split between these two builds. That is not indecision. That is just building a portfolio that actually matches how you sleep at night. If you want to see exactly which low-cost ETFs I use to build out the engine and anchored jobs we just talked about, click the video right here on the screen, and I'll walk you through them step by step. I'll see you over there. And if you only take one thing from this entire video, let it be this. The biggest mistake isn't picking the wrong fund out of these 5. Every single one of them is a reasonable, rock-solid, low-fee choice. The biggest mistake is picking none of them. It's staying in cash, letting standard US inflation quietly eat your purchasing power, waiting for a better time, while 30 years of compounding walks by without you. You don't need $150,000 to start this. You just need a plan for where the next dollar you invest goes, and then you need to leave it alone. Thanks to fractional shares at almost every major US brokerage today, whether you're working with $150,000 or just $50 out of this week's paycheck, the 5 jobs are exactly the same, and so is the math. If this helped you actually understand why your allocation matters, and not just which random tickers to buy, hit subscribe. This channel breaks down one real portfolio decision like this every single week. No hype, just the numbers. And drop a comment below. Are you leaning toward the income build, the growth build, or something in between? I read every single one. You've got the 5 funds, and you've got the 2 ways to build them. Now it's time to decide which future you're actually building toward.